Good afternoon, everyone. We're just letting a couple of folks click in here. We see the count is going up. So we have about we had over 70 people sign up and we have about 15 clicked in. So just give it another minute and we'll go ahead and get started. All righty. Well, we'll be sharing a link to the video when we're done, so folks can continue to kind of sign in. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for Compensation Uncomplicated, Mastering Your 2025 Strategy. We're gonna have a little fun this afternoon and start with some myth busting, and then jump into the core content of the presentation. Talk about what you signed up for to hear about. As we're going through the presentation, wanted to let you know we've set the content up to leave quite a bit of time, probably 15-20 minutes at the end of the presentation to just kind of have open mic Q&A. So as we're going through, please drop your questions in the chat, and we'll come back around full circle at the end of the content and just spend some time going through answering as many of the questions as we can. We start with introductions of your compensation strategist. Actually, the compensation strategist is the young man, the gentleman to my right. I'm Ruben Moreno, founder and practice leader at Blue Rock Search, and I'm honored to introduce my co-host, friend and colleague, Nate Young. Nate's the founder and chief comp strategist at Paidwell. So
awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nate. Always enjoy it when we get to do these things together. So, all right. Well, let's just go ahead and get started and jump into some myth busting. First one we talk about is compensation is the most important thing candidates care about. And this is one, as an executive search leader, I run into, quite often. And here's what I would say. Compensation has and continues to be an important part of the candidate value proposition. However, these days, remote and flex work has squarely jumped out in front in terms of importance. And this isn't just from a candidate perspective, this is candidates and employees. So both internally and externally, we often provide advice and counsel in this space, and we talk about the three most important things that candidates, employees care about. We call it the talent trinity, which is culture, career, and compensation. And just simply put, you have to have in today's market a compelling story for every single one of those. Nate, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that comp is important. I don't want to downplay the importance of comp, but comp is just one of the main factors that we hear that we apply and that we use with our customers to make sure they can attract and retain that key talent they need to.
Awesome, thank you. Next one we talk about is, candidates will wait and accept lower offers for the prestige of working here. And put simply, what I would, and I have these conversations often as well, this is a losing strategy when you're trying to land high demand, low availability talent. Simply put, these candidates have options. And time lapse between final interview and offer also is going to negatively impact your offer acceptance rates. So if by chance you're seeing offer acceptance rates go down or not where you want them to be, might want to take a look at the data to see how much time is it taking between final interview and offer. And the other piece on this one is, I think brand pride, right? We are proud of the work we do and the culture that we have built at our organization. That's an awesome thing. That's a great thing. In fact, that's where we should start. The big difference between that and organizational arrogance, which is, you should consider yourself lucky to even be considered for an opportunity with our organization. So just really understanding, fundamental difference between the two. Nate, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is one that I would probably think about, like real world examples of some of the most prestigious companies that people can talk about or think about to go work for. They're not necessarily they don't come to mind because of their pay. They may also happen to pay really well, but that's not true for all of them. And a lot of times it's more about what you can learn, the kind of work you can do, the impact you can have, and those sorts of things, not just the comp.
Awesome. Thanks. Nate, I'm going to hand it all over to you for this next one.
Yeah. So this is one that, in terms of the over under here, we hear, pretty frequently as an older habit, and this is one I think we should absolutely break, and that is that we should make lower offers and make candidates negotiate. We recommend typically not doing that. What we'd actually recommend you do is pre-close a candidate or an employee if they're being promoted or transferred to get a sense of what their expectations are, thinking about what resources you have available, right, in terms of what offer you can make. And every time that you have the ability to do so, we recommend doing your first, best, and final offer in one go, right? And one, it saves time. It creates higher quality outcomes. The person's going to be able to get right where they need to or not, very quickly. But it's also the first step you may be taking with a relationship with a new team member. And we always want to ask, do you want the precedent to be that they know now that to get more, they have to fight for it? And is that the step you want to start off on the first step of the journey with this team member on your team? This is not the best thing to kind of start off that relationship, and may even make it a poor outcome both for you and them. At the end of the day, if that's what you want, by all means, stick to your own ethos and your own philosophy of how you want to approach this. But for most folks, really reflect on how you want this relationship to start. And if you can go to first, final, best in one go, save yourself time, get the hire you need, and be extremely straightforward with your communication with a new team member, we recommend you do that.
And I'll tell you on this one, most of the search we do is helping our clients hire HR executives, and so we talk about first, best, final with our clients, and we also tell our candidates as we go through our pre-close process that is the approach that we're going to take. So we always highly encourage that, and particularly in the HR culture, and environment, we advise our clients, a good HR person, will know within about their first hour of employment what that package was. So, it's really about putting your best foot forward on the way in.
All right. This next one is one that I think is one that's been during my career has been a pretty major change. And this is one I would say the myth here is that a candidate's salary history is what determines their value. And I would say, in short, without grossly oversimplifying this, no, right? Not only is this probably not a good idea in general, but it may even be illegal. Depending on where your candidate is and where your offer is. And we recommend getting out of this habit because there are not only more compliant, but also just more effective ways to get what you want here. And instead, we recommend asking questions like, hey, what are you looking for in terms of the comp package for your next role? Or, hey, based on what you've heard about the company and the job we have to offer, what do you think what kind of offer do you think we would need to make to get to a yes, to get you to say yes right away? And the last thing of this is, like, frankly, this is just like not to be overly pragmatic here, but like what folks currently make doesn't matter. What they will accept for the next job does. And that's where get yourself out of the habit. One, you can be more ethical, more compliant, and three, you can make good decisions based on data that will get you to yes, not heuristics or rule of thumb that you think, what's happening out, what you may or may not have heard versus what's true, right? You can just get to the quick.
Yeah, and Nate, on this one, we talk about this often on the executive search side, and kind of our motto internally is we talk about comp early and often, right? There's this misnomer that says we can no longer talk about comp. It's illegal. I believe at latest count, there's 21 states where you can't talk about it and have direct conversation. There's 29 where nothing has really changed. So both on the candidate side and the employer side, we start at the very beginning so that when we get to the finish line from an expectations management standpoint, we're within the target range. Both sides know what to expect, and you don't run into this. So it's really, and I love the way you said it, Nate, right? It's frankly what folks are making doesn't matter. It's what they will accept.
Right.
And when you have an prospective candidate that's made it through a multiple hurdle selection process and they are the selected finalist, the goal is to get them landed.
That's right. All right. So this myth here is that, we don't need to worry about pay transparency until we're required to, right? And this is one that, like, I reserve the right to be wrong here. I've been wrong before. It'll happen again. This is one that I could be wrong about. I'm okay with that. But I personally don't believe pay transparency is going away. I think it's a question of when, not if. And then to what degree is transparency going to be required? And the key thing for me is to think about setting ourselves up for success here. And the best way we can think of that I would recommend you can prepare for pay transparency is just focus on your foundations, your fundamentals, those things like having set standards, executive alignment, visibility to begin that alignment work so that, if you are legally required to be transparent about your pay, you've got your side of the street clean to make sure that we've brought people into band, that we have clear standards and that sort of thing. But if you do that, and let's say pay transparency, let's say I'm wrong, pay transparency isn't something that's going to be inevitable and is coming. If you do all that stuff and you prepare yourself for pay transparency to where you could be, you're going to get a clear competitive advantage against your talent competitors because you'll have all those things in a row. You'll have them set up and you'll be able to articulate clearly the kind of talent you're looking for, how to make those offers and make sure you're competitive, fair, consistent, so that when you want to hire those people, you can. And if the law requires it, you're good. If the law doesn't require it, you're still good, right?
Absolutely. Well, look, the way I look at it, whatever you can do in today's, tight labor market for that, high demand, low availability talent that gives you that upper edge, the competitive advantage, always going to recommend that.
That's right.
But that, Nate, thanks a lot for that, right? Because we had some fun talking about what some of those myths were and how we'd address it to open. But let's get to the meat of the matter, right? Let's transition over to the 3 key topics that the audience signed up for. We're going to talk this afternoon about salary budgets, pay transparency, and pay equity. Really looking forward to hearing your wise counsel and how these mistakes can be avoided with the right planning and preparation.
Sounds good.
So let's go right into salary budgets.
Yeah. All right. So this is one that could be pretty straightforward. However, like these are a few resources, a couple resources I like to use. Some other ones you may want to consider might be Mercer, Radford, Culpeper, Deloitte, you name it. But for estimated pay movement, this is a really important thing to flag. You may be hearing, depending on who you talk to, things are cooling down. That is true. But what you can see here for the past 3 years, pay movement in the market, so what companies budget for their salary increases next year, has gone down. And what we're expecting next year for 2025 is somewhere between 3.8 and 3.9% for the US. But just know, for most of my career, at least early on, the normal numbers might be anywhere from 2.9 to 3.5%. We are not in situation normal. And that's where I would say, hotter market, inflation, there are a variety of good and bad reasons for why pay movement is what it is. But it's really critical to base your salary budgets on real market data so you're not caught next year without a budget to make the hiring, transfer, promo decisions you need to make. And that rule of thumb of blanket 3% will not work if you're going to want to stay competitive. Granted, everyone has budget constraints or not, but the key thing of that is, do the best that you can. But at the end of the day, if you're doing it based on a heuristic or, you're listening to the wind or whatever the case is around, hey, we think this thing is happening, that's when we'd say, if you can make decisions based on data, let's do that. And finally here, this is another one common thing we might see with customers is we set that budget for salary increase next year. We're going to set 3.9%. That's what Willis Towers Watson or World at Work or Radford or any of these other companies tell me to do. I'm going to do that. But then we might not account for things like market adjustments. So things like, hey, we implemented a new pay program. We still have team members maybe below band. We had folks that maybe we promoted them and we didn't have the budget to get them into the band where we wanted. And that's where you might need to make market adjustments. There's a variety of these, but keep that in mind when you're setting your budget, is you might want to also adjust people independent of a normal merit process. And the last two we see are pretty common. One is extremely common, and that's promotions. Promotions in most merit cycles, if you do promos when you also do your compensation increases, they will eat up most of your budget, because not only is the person getting a raise, they're probably skipping an entire level, right? Or pay grade or whatever the case you've got. And that promotion bid is one that not including those in your budget can really harm you. And it can take away from resources that you might want to allocate towards merit, pay for performance, market adjustments, and other pieces. So if you account for these up front, you can avoid that. And the last thing here, just double clicking on that pay movement, pay data topic, is we really recommend not taking the peanut butter approach, not just to give everyone, avoid giving everyone the same increase, but also think about your jobs differently. And this is where we'd say at least once a year, check your benchmarks, check your bands, because you may want to double click on a specific job to say, hey, this job here may be cooling down, these jobs here may be moving up, and you could be over or under spending at that competitive level, still be competitive, and you won't know. And that's the really key thing to keep in mind, is you want to tune those pay bands and pay grades at least on an annual basis, or at least evaluate to tune those on an annual basis to make sure you're not lagging or leading on any particular jobs.
Awesome. Talk about switching over pay transparency, right? Lots of conversations about this these days.
Yeah. So this is one, like I said earlier, I think this is one that playing to win rather than playing not to lose is the strategy I would take here. And if you're playing to win, the key thing of this is I want to be great at recruiting. I want to hire the best people that I can. I want to be great at keeping people, right? I want to make sure that my key talent stays in my business and they do the best job they can. If that's the case, you see this map, you may not have a choice for what you tell people, right? In terms of what you share, what you put in job postings, that sort of thing. But pay transparency is expanding. There are several states you can see here that already have things on the books, some that are, maybe moving into the books, right, in legislation. And this is something we expect to continue over time, even if by degrees. But just to really take this one home is if you do the work so you can be transparent, especially in any of these states, one, you're going to be compliant. That means you can share your pay bands, you have them developed. And if your team members see them and you've done the work up front, you've got that piece set aside. If you don't do this work and you don't have those foundations in place, and then you're required to disclose that by law anyway, you could put yourself in a position where, we could have thought ahead and got these things done. And this is the part for me that's really important, is that you can prep for pay transparency now, have those great foundations. And if pay transparency doesn't, for whatever reason, get to you, you're still good. You've not overinvested here. And these are a few things I'd recommend, maybe just taking a look to think, how can I prep for pay transparency? And it's really about building those strong foundations. And one of my favorite quotes here is, if we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinion, let's go with mine. The first tip we recommend here is build data-driven budgets. So picking 3% because of what you did last year, bad idea. Picking 3% because that's what your market data tells you should, based on what we're expecting here, you can be competitive by budgeting this amount. Great idea. And that's where the budgets we have set up may be insufficient to get the work done we need to get done. And that's where it's really critical, especially this time of year for most of our customers. Think ahead, get that data, get those budgets set aside so you can really focus on getting that work done next year, and you can afford to do it without breaking the bank. Next, I'd say these fundamentals. These are things that fundamentals, right? Not to sound too much like Lombardi here, but I think at the end of the day, this is one that where it comes down to it, is that having that career framework, having a clear comp philosophy that articulates what and how you want to pay for, having your leadership have command of that message and be aligned on this is how we do things, and then clearly communicating it, that's what to do. And I know that sounds silly. I know I may be, Nate-splaining here, but at the end of the day, this is something that's really critical. The best way to be good at your game is to have strong, fundamentals. And the last piece here is communicate, right? You've done all this work. You've got all these things together. You've got the right things built into what you do. Your program is only as good as your team members understand and it's communicated to them, right? So having that talent trinity that you mentioned earlier, I love that concept. And it's that career development, lifestyle and culture, and total rewards, having those things lined up, articulated well, that clearly, this is what your business wants to value and how you value things, getting your leadership on board with that and giving them the tools and enabling them to communicate it, right? That right there is like chef's kiss for how to kind of seal the deal on getting these foundations in place, making sure people know about it, and then having them feel it and know it.
Awesome. Love this topic, Nate. We talk about this one often, right? So just let's talk about blending pay equity and performance-based pay.
Yeah. So this is our whole shtick at Paid Well. For us, we want to do performance-based, equitable, consistent programs, right? And these quadrants that you see here, it's a little oversimplified, but This is meant to guide us conceptually. And the way this works is brass tacks. What you want is your best paid, lowest performing people to get less of your budget. You want your lowest paid, best performing people to get more of your budget.
Right.
And I could go way down the rabbit hole on this topic and talk about, pay for performance matrices and algorithms and all kinds of other things that we may have developed to kind of go at this. But I think philosophically, whatever level of sophistication that you're at, if you go into it with this mindset, people who are further from their target, who are better performing, should get more of my budget. And people who are lower performing and higher paid should get less of my budget. That's the way to go. And if you really nail this, this gets you out of the business of managing that pay equity separately from your pay for performance and those sorts of things. What it does, it gets you in the business of managing performance. Because if it gets you out of managing comp and pay equity as a discrete thing and you're focused on performance, the outcome will automatically be there, right? You can achieve pay equity and pay for performance by focusing on that performance piece if you link them this way. And it also helps you make decisions. It makes what raise do I give someone gets way easier if you have a matrix like this to guide your decisions.
Awesome. I love this one. We talk about this one often. Bring us home, Nate. Just kind of key points, key takeaways.
Yeah. So this is for me really three main things. Is uncertainty is something we're going to have to live with right now. I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot of information in the world, and there's a lot of it that may or may not apply to you, and there's a lot of it that may or may not be accurate, right? Or relevant to what you're doing. And what we always think about here is I wouldn't focus so much on what other companies are doing, right? Use your benchmarks to get a sense of what may be normal in your industry, but think about your own problems. What vertical are you in? What talent are you trying to attract and retain? Where have you struggled in the past? And I think this is like a simple thing, but thinking about how to solve your own problems. One, solve your problems, and two, it also means you're not worried about stuff that may not be relevant to you. And this is at the end of the day, we just say paddle your own canoe, take care of your own stuff, and you'll get to where you need to be. The last two topics here, I think for me, are like myth busting in general. Just like today, we're sitting down with you and saying, hey, these are some mindsets that we still observe, but they could be problematic. We should go through and think about not what we are doing and what the heuristics or rules of thumb are, but what does data tell us? What is most effective? What is best practice? That needs to trickle down inside your business. So if you know these things, right, you need to make sure you're commanding that message into your business so you can myth bust. So for example, if your team members a year ago, 2 years ago, were coming to you and saying, hey, inflation's wild, I should get a raise. Now's a good time to point out inflation's coming down, interest rates are coming down. You don't necessarily need to educate here or overemphasize it, but it's a really important thing to note that people understand what's happening in the market. And that, for example, you're getting more value. If you're adding investment into your benefits program, or, hey, we went through a data exercise with an external comp firm to make sure our pay is, use those things to myth bust to say, hey, no, we know, or we have data, right? Or help me understand where this is coming from. But eliminating those opinions, right, that may not be relevant, or helping educate people, that myth busting in general can really drive home the benefits of all the stuff you've worked hard to build. And the last thing here, there are a million ways comp can be done, right? And I always like to joke people, it's like Taco Bell, right? It's got like 3 ingredients, just served 10,000 ways. But at the end of the day, we always stress, keep it simple. I know that sounds silly, but back to the Trinity, lifestyle and culture, career development, and then rewards, that trifecta there is what a lot of folks care about for their current job and their next job. And you can use that to manage basically anyone. But the way this breaks down is that they can't articulate it. If your leaders can't explain it, if they can't walk you through it and tell it to their teams, the ability for that program to be successful diminishes dramatically. You're only as good at any program you build as your leaders can communicate to their teams. So keep it simple, keep it effective. Last piece here, I referenced a few resources. There are a ton here that you can go into. These are 3 that I like to look at every year, and that'd be World at Work, Mercer, Willis Towers Watson, and they give you a lot of really great data. And today, a lot of the stuff we referenced was for the U.S. specific. A lot of folks we know on the call are going to have international team members, and that's where I would just stress, go to the source. We have these linked. You can go and take a look at them yourself, and that way you can kind of hear direct from the source around what the data is saying for different markets.
And we'll, of course, we'll share this presentation with those links so that you can refer to them. And then if any of you would like to go deeper on a particular conversation, our contact information will, of course, be at the end, and you can reach out directly for an in-depth conversation on any one of the particular topics. So now we're going to transition over, looking at Q&As in the chat. So I'm going to switch over and see what questions we have. All right.
Chat. All right.
Okay, first question. Can you talk about the calibration process for performance pay decisions and when it is best to do that? Nate, this is you.
Yeah, great question, Ava. I think here that at the end of the day, this is one that on that calibration process, what we always say is good fences make good neighbors. So setting up with your executive team or whoever your comp planners are ahead of a comp cycle and communicating to say, hey, we are paying for performance. I know that sounds really simple, but literally just saying that in your comp philosophy or in what expectation you set for the team, we're not paying based on tenure. We're not paying based on where they worked last. Things like that will really help go a long way on the calibration process. But finally, it's sitting down and saying, I usually like to let the professionals handle this. So if you have a comp team, a finance team, or other folks in HR, work with your talent management, performance management folks, learning and org development, depending on who might be in this conversation, set that pay for performance matrix if you build one up front. So if you know, hey, we have a top performer who's an exceeds, we have a strong performer who's a meets, and a lower performer who's a partially meets, up front, if your budget is 4%, that might look like 5% for the top performer, 3% for the average performer, and you may put 0 or 1 or 2% for the lower performer. And when you do that, you can draft those recommendations up front, how you balance your budget versus the performance bit. Then you can go back through that and say if they are in our pay range, right? Normally for this job, we give them 3%. If they're above the pay range, we give them 2% or 1%. And if they're below the pay range, we give them 4%. Multiply those, and you've got a really good reference target based on performance and how far they are from the band for every person. And I know that's a little like seeing it might be easier to kind of do in that with that kind of scenario. But the key thing is that you calibrate that based on not just performance, but also where they're starting. And that way you can achieve pay equity and pay for performance through one exercise. And if Eva, if you want to talk about that more in depth or connect with me separately to kind of talk what that might be, that's definitely something I can help draft.
Thanks, Nate. I'm going to take a first crack at this next one and let you chime in. All I can say is, Melissa, I feel your pain. So how do you frame the 3 offers, first, best, and final, to a candidate when they're not when they're not sharing expectations and the team internally isn't sharing a budget? I'd love to say that I've never experienced this one, but experience it more often than not. Here's what I would recommend. A couple of things that we do. One, again, going back to we discuss compensation early and often, is setting the expectation on the front end, both with hiring manager and candidate, what the range for the position is going to be. We also actually, with Nate's help, we have a couple of tools we use where we provide the market data for the right relevant compensation, and it's market-based pricing for that job. So in the absence of either side, and this is a really difficult one, for you, is based on years of experience and the market rate, make that competitive offer that says at 50th percentile for this job you're at X, at 75th percentile you're at Y, and then have the internal department make said decision, knowing that it's an educated decision that they're making. And unfortunately, you're left to go, quote unquote, into this process with a blind offer, but you're doing it based on what the market dictates, not either side. Not ideal, but when all else fails, use the data. And that's what we do. So we come back with external data, hopefully to bring the two sides to the desired conclusion or outcome, excuse me. Just a question from Sydney. Nate, I'm going to give you this one. What are you seeing for a budget for promotions and/or market adjustments?
Yeah. So this is one that will vary by firm, right? And I know that's the most consultant answer ever, right? It varies. But what I will say is the way I like to think about this would be what percentage of your team members typically get promoted? So if you have data going back even a couple of years to estimate, hey, we usually see 10% promotions in our main cycle, that sort of thing, you can automatically start to get a handle on, okay, we've got 10% of our team members we're going to estimate for promotion. Okay, so we have 1,000 team members, 100 of them may get promoted, right? The average salary for folks outside of the executive team, because that's going to be less common at the exec level, depending on how many folks you've got to get promoted. Average salary times, that 100 team members that you think are going to get promoted, right? You can even do it by level if you prefer to get a little more granularity here. But then you take that and say, okay, now if we took the average person in our company, and for me, depending on your comp philosophy and your promotion philosophy, I generally like to move promotions to the bottom of the next range. That way they can start to progress through that range if we're using a pay for performance philosophy, right? So if that's the case, average salary, average person distance and percentage from the bottom of their next band, which may be if you have ranges that are 15%, 30%, that sort of thing. That's where you can then say 7%, 10%. Take that times the average salary. You've got a really great starter at a high level for promo budget. And usually what happens there is it would come down based on actuals or higher, depending on what how fast you're growing and that sort of thing. And that's where I would say here, mathematically, it's easy to do. Heuristics, if you just want to use a rule of thumb, generally most people between jobs can expect between 7 and 15%, depending on your industry and the level of the job. That may sound like a lot, and it could be compared to most merit budgets. But the key thing to keep in mind, if they're a top performer and they left, you'd be extremely upset. If the average percent between jobs is 7 to 15%, our promo budget should probably be between 7 and 15%, especially considering their jumping levels. And that's a really good thing to keep in mind and using that market data for what people get in a new job, because for a promo or, sometimes an increase, you may not be competing with what they're making now. You may be competing with the offers they could get, right? And that's a really critical thing to keep in mind for promos who I'd assume are key talent.
Yeah, and Nate, thank you for that, because I think part of that is, right, looking at it from an executive search perspective, being competitive and relevant internally from a promotion perspective and retention. In some instances, it's a difference between them taking the call and not taking the call.
That's right.
Right. So it's proactively approaching that. Next question, Lori, is there anything different we should consider for executive comp? And how about the PE industry? Nate, I'm going to let you hit executive comp, and I'll come back on PE industry.
Yeah. So this is going to get a little deep into the weeds, right? But the way I would define executive roles, right, would be executives are typically responsible not just for managing people and teams and performance and objectives inside the calendar year. In my definition, executives are generally responsible for the long-term strategy of the firm, right? So for an executive to execute or develop, then execute the long-term strategy of the firm and how successful it be, we need to keep them for the long term. And you can probably see where I'm going with this as a comp person. It's LTI, long-term incentives. Their cash is always going to be the key thing for most folks. So they need to pay their bills, and that's a big part of what they do. But as soon as you start to go up the organizational charts, you'll notice that a lot of people's compensation, it goes up in the long term, not necessarily in pure cash. And that's where you see things like inside the calendar year for executives, hitting your goals this year, super critical. Having a significant or a meaningful portion of their pay based on this year's goals, i.e., an MBO, a company incentive plan, a bonus plan based on their performance, their department's performance, functional performance, and the company performance, something along those lines, super critical to make sure you said, we did, we paid, right? That's where set the strategy, hit the strategy, we pay you. And then that long-term value, we're really counting on our executives to make, where they're adding, value to the business over time based on the strategies they're developing. That's where the things like your LTI, so equity, right? Your, stock options, RSUs, PSUs, performance incentive stock, all kinds of stuff, SARs, you name it. This is where we really want to hone in on. For me, long-term incentive is super critical for executives and bonuses. And that way we make sure we hit our goals every single year. They get paid for it. So now they're incentivized to keep that flywheel spinning. And when you think about that 3 to 5 year window around where's our company going to be and who have we hired to help us get there, that's how we comp them to make sure we hit those goals. Because if we don't, and they don't get their LTI, they feel it. If they do, and they get paid on it, that's what we want, that goal reward alignment.
Nate, you're the SME in this space, but what I've found kind of rule of thumb as I talk to candidates when it comes to STI and LTI, I see a direct correlation between industry and the aggressiveness of those plans. So for instance, low margin businesses, we have QSR clients, right?
Yep.
Those numbers are going to be in the teens. And then you go over to our tech clients where, multiple double digits, 65%, 100% equity in some cases from a tech perspective on the LTI side. Any rule of thumb? That's my swag. Is that kind of what you see? Because you're in this space every day.
Yeah, it's generally about value creation, right? So what you'll see is the industries that you typically see, there's a higher emphasis on LTI, so long-term incentives. This is a rule of thumb, right? This is like generally speaking, but I usually equate it to margins. And not just the margins you can make per unit, but what can we add to this business, both in incremental value and intrinsic value, right? So that LTI pays off in the long term. And it's really about value creation. And so when you think about stage, you think about vertical industry, you name it, that's a big part of it, is that if you can create more value over a longer time. And back to Lori's question, not to dodge the second part, PE industry, so private equity in general, VCs, and those sorts of firms, a lot of times it's not about where the business is. It's about the value you can create over the long term. And that's what I would say here. You're going to see this even more true for companies like that or firms like that. And if you were talking about working directly for a PE as opposed to one of the portcos, this is where I'm sure you know this, but at the end of the day, that's where you see even more emphasis on LTI, long-term incentive for things like carry, right? So when you have that like in-firm carry around how the funds are performing at working in PE, that's where you can really see a lot of really big value created for the person. But usually those are going to pay out over 8 years, right? And that's a really key thing to keep in mind, which is LTI. We're not talking about someone who is trying to make a buck in the next 6 months. We're not talking about someone whose strategies can play out inside the next year. We're talking about long-term value and long-term planning, and I would say sometimes pretty sophisticated strategy to develop that long-term value for the business, for the firm, for the portco, you name it, wherever you're at. And that's where those executives, that is literally their job. Pick the right strategy, executes the strategy, add value over time. And that's where I really emphasize my focus on those types of roles.
Yeah, and what I'm seeing right now in PE, and it's an interesting one because as holding periods are lengthening in time, at the portco level, I was actually just talking to a CHRO for a private equity backed organization and said, we're facing an interesting thing. We're actually beginning to lose executives to the Fortune 1000. And what he said was they were having to spend more on base and STI from a cash-rich plan perspective because with the longer holding period, some of their executives, depending on where they were in their career life cycle, were opting to for the publicly traded for RSUs and options in the publicly traded world, as opposed to betting on an outcome 5 to 8 years down the road. Because historically, what I've seen at the portco level, base salaries not as aggressive, STI more aggressive than their peers in the publicly traded world. And then on the wealth accumulation side, whether it's 0.25, 0.5, 0.75 is usually what I see for HR folks, at the portco level. That's where the wealth accumulation is. So selling that to say, here's what that looks like. It's not just base to base or total cash to total cash. That's what we deal with in PE. See if we have any more. Is there a rule of thumb for how often to review your overall comp structure and ranges? Yeah. Nate, that's all you.
Yeah, so this is where I would say that at the end of the day, this is one it's going to be true to you, right? And thinking about like what the answer is here. However, I would say if you have the resources to check at least twice a year, I would. And this is a really critical thing to flag. It's the same thing for evaluating your employees' compensation. We are not committing to giving everyone a raise, and we are not committing to overhauling all of your comp structure and ranges every single year or twice a year. What I would commit to is evaluating and checking to see if you should make a change. I personally don't like to update comp structures too much. Like a big part of our philosophy is to start with a strong fundamental program that can scale. And that would be hey, you can build something that you can update base, bonus, equity, exec comp, you name it, every single year until you hit the scale you want to be at. What I'd rather do is set up a really solid base salary structure and a bonus program at certain levels that we can expand later. We can raise the targets, we can expand eligibility, all that kind of stuff. Not changing the structure, doubling down on the structure. Updating structures completely would be things where I would go back and look at, one, how are we currently implementing it? What is it based on? And if you can check all those boxes, hey, we're implementing it perfectly. The targets are not, are correct. We can go look at benchmarks in our market, at our, in our vertical, at our revenue, at our headcount, whatever the case would be. This is what we're seeing. Then I would go back and look at the structures. Are we paying for the right things? Is the plan designed the right way? Or, do we have salary ranges built the right way? Otherwise, most companies will probably not need to update their structures. It's more about their targets. If you're starting off with what is best practice or what you think would fit to solve your own problem. And the last part of this, if you're not sure, pull in an expert. You can have someone like, myself or, Ruben, has his team as well to sit down and say, hey, we're taking a look at these things. What gaps do you see? And generally what I see with most of my customers, it's either one of two things. It's they're not offering something they should, meaning, hey, we have an executive role that's only offering base and bonus, not equity. That's something, if you want them to focus on long-term, compensating them for the long-term is pretty typical. Or what we see is we have the right structure, we don't have the right targets. And that's where you want to check your benchmarks and your data to make sure that you can pull those in place.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate.
Yeah.
Melissa, thank you for this question. I'm excited to have Nate answer it because it feels like a stumper. So what recommendations do you have for a national organization that has staff across multiple states? The perception of staff can be challenging when you practice pay transparency. Any suggestions, Nate?
Yeah. So a couple things here. This one's got a couple layers to it. But I would say back to our question around, or the quote here around, if we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with yours, Melissa, is what I would say here. But the short of it is literally just to say, hey, let's go pull some data. Let's get a sense of what states we have folks in, not just what states, but also what cities we have those folks in. A lot of cities can be very different than the states that they're located in. And there are really two things here, right? It's about competitiveness, and that's where you get your data. Are we paying competitively? Do we have pay bands that are based on our industry that are competitive? And if you go look at that data and you see it, and then you can double down on that by going into, are we losing people, right? Are they quitting? And that sort of thing. If you're not losing people and you're filling your recs and your pay data says you're fine, you're probably fine, right? You can still lose people, and you can have team members that are still upset with you and still think they're underpaid. All of those facts aside, back to my comment earlier, the two things we think about here are going to be communication and what I would call like command of the message or manager enablement. If you're paying fairly, you have a comp structure, you have internal mobility, all these things, but my manager isn't telling me that because they don't know and they haven't been told what they can or cannot talk about, which in comp, there are a lot of buzzsaws. And sometimes a manager may not, hey, let me go grab HR, right? They may not want to have that conversation. And that's where what I would say here is that you want to enable your leaders to have that conversation at the level they need to have it at, to the extent you're comfortable with them having it. A lot of times when we see that multi-state, we're not paying competitively, people have perceptions. Sometimes we have a customer who's not paying well. However, I too tend to believe that that's usually by role by level. The market's going to bear what the market's going to bear. If you're recruiting people and you're keeping people, more than likely, it's about the team members on that team not knowing what they have access to. What benefits do they have? What about their PTO? What about their education tuition reimbursements? Do they know that you've benchmarked these jobs and you have data that indicate, what's happening here? And the last part of this for me, and this is where I said earlier, I always try to, I reserve the right to be wrong. I also reserve the right to get smarter. Learn from reality. If you're sitting down with your team members and they're all telling you your pay is bad, your data source says it's good, and you're losing people and you can't keep them. If you raise the pay by $1 or whatever their job is, right? I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but if you increase that pay to the extent that you think you can make those team members happy, what have you lost?
Right.
From a budget perspective, from a retention perspective, if keeping those folks, erodes your unit economics or margins or something similar, right? But you keep producing, you keep doing the work you want to do, and more importantly, if it is a fact that you would lose people otherwise, you may not have a choice.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I just switched over to our thank you slide. So you'll see our contact information, both for myself and for Nate. Nate, first, let me start.
That's great.
By thanking you. I love it when we get to do these things together, for being my co-host. Always a pleasure. And to our guest, thank you very much for your participation, the questions at the end, and then really hope you got something out of it. And you'll join us the next time. We'll be sure to send you the link so you can refer to the information in the future. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you all. Appreciate you.
Bye-bye.